What if I told you that the great American dream of home ownership was forged not from money or laws, but from dirt, moss, and the simple skill of wielding an axe? When settlers arrived in the Wild West, they did not find ready-made cities or building supply stores. They were greeted only by endless forests and land that had to be tamed with their bare hands. This is not a story about cowboys or shootouts, but about the quiet, everyday heroism that built the country. It is about how one family, armed with only a few tools and an iron will, was able to turn a plot of wild forest into a fortress capable of withstanding both blizzards and scorching heat. This process was not just construction, it was a ritual of transforming raw nature into civilization. In this video, we will go all the way from the first blow of the axe on a living tree to the smoke coming out of the chimney of the finished hut. We will break down each stage, from selecting the perfect pine trees to mixing the very clay that sealed the walls from the icy wind. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn what one single element of the structure, created without a single nail, made these log houses practically eternal. What if I told you that everything you believed about building in the Wild West was untrue? We imagined brave individuals simply arriving and cutting down trees wherever they pleased. However, in reality, building a house was not only a physical act, but also a legal one. The Homestead Act of 1862 was the foundation of this process, offering 160 acres of land to anyone who was willing to cultivate it, and most importantly, build a permanent dwelling on it. This law dictated the settlers' first steps. Before putting an axe to a tree, a person had to find their plot, mark it out, and register their rights. Choosing a location was the first and most important decision on which survival depended. It was not just land, it was a compromise between access to water, availability of wood, and soil quality for future fields. Settlers rarely had the opportunity to bring many tools with them. The set consisted of the bare essentials: an axe, an adze, an auger, and possibly a saw. Nails were an incredible luxury and were valued by weight in silver, so the entire construction of the house had to do without them. This necessity gave rise to unique construction methods based on precise fitting and carpentry skills. The very act of selecting trees for felling was a science in itself. Straight, tall trunks of uniform thickness were needed, preferably pine, spruce, or oak, depending on the region. The pioneer had to mentally see his future home in the standing forest, estimating which tree would be used for the foundation and which for the walls. This required experience and a deep understanding of forest resources. Thus, the construction of a hut began not with cutting, but with planning. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that this land now had an owner. The first trunk cut down was not just a building material, but a symbol of the beginning of a new life. It was this balance between law, planning, and hard work that determined the success of the entire enterprise. Building a house was the first step toward creating a farm and securing the future. The quality of this first dwelling determined whether the family would survive the coming winter. It was not about comfort, but about basic shelter. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What did you think about the construction process in the Wild West up to this point? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other stories about frontier development. Are you ready to learn the truth about how people actually chose a location for their home when not only comfort, but also survival depended on it? The first thing a settler looked for was a reliable source of fresh water. The ideal location was considered to be near a stream or spring, but not in a low-lying area. A location at the bottom of a valley was risky due to spring floods and cold, damp air. Good drainage was the second most important factor. They tried to build their huts on a small hill or natural slope so that rainwater and meltwater would run off the foundation rather than accumulate under it. This prevented the lower logs from rotting, which were the most vulnerable part of the house. The ground beneath the house had to be firm, not swampy. The third factor was access to resources, primarily wood. Settlers had to find a balance. The house should not be too far from trees in order to minimize the effort required to transport heavy logs. At the same time, it had to be built at a sufficient distance to have a clean area around the dwelling and space for a future vegetable garden. The location in relation to the cardinal points was also of great importance. The front door and most of the windows, if planned, were oriented to the south or east. This allowed for maximum sunlight and heat during the day, which was critical during the cold months. The north side, which was most exposed to the wind, had to be the most solid. Once the location was chosen, the site was cleared of shrubs and turf. There was no foundation in the modern sense. Instead, large flat stones were laid at the corners of the future building. These stones served as supports and raised the first, most important crown of logs above the ground, protecting it from moisture and rot. Leveling these cornerstones was a critically important step. The settlers used primitive levels or simply by eye to ensure that all four corners were in the same horizontal plane. A mistake at this stage would lead to the entire structure being skewed, and it would be impossible to correct it later. A crown of 4 thick, sturdy logs was laid on top of these stones. They were carefully hewn and joined at the corners. These logs had to bear the weight of the entire house. They were often made of the strongest wood, such as oak, even if the rest of the hut was built of pine. Sometimes, if resources and time allowed, a shallow trench was dug around the entire perimeter of the house and filled with stones, creating a kind of strip foundation. This was very rare for the first temporary dwelling, but this approach immediately made the house more durable. Most often, only cornerstones were used to save precious time. The process of laying the foundation was slow and meditative. It did not require as much strength as felling a forest, but it did require precision and patience. Every detail, every stone, every first cut on a log determined the future of the house. It was a real, tangible beginning of construction. The foundation was ready, and now the builder faced the most difficult task, preparing dozens of identical logs for the walls. How did the settlers turn round trunks into smooth building blocks using only an axe? In the next chapter, we will talk about a tool that was not just an axe, but a true symbol of the era. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the frontier. The axe was not just a tool, it was an extension of the settler's arm, his main means of survival. But what if I told you that not all axes were the same? The true king of the Wild West was not the ordinary axe, but the specialized American axe, or settler's axe, which was itself the pinnacle of engineering at the time. Unlike its European counterparts, which were often heavy and unbalanced, the American axe was designed for efficiency. It had a distinctive blade shape and, most importantly, a perfectly balanced handle made of durable hickory, American walnut. This handle was curved, allowing for more powerful and accurate strikes with less fatigue. Each settler had at least 2 types of axes. The first was a felling axe. It had a relatively narrow but heavy blade designed to penetrate deep into the wood across the grain. It was used to cut down trees and chop off branches. The speed of the entire logging process depended on its sharpness and balance. The second, and no less important, was the broadaxe. This tool looked completely different. It had a very wide, flat blade, sharpened on only one side like a chisel. Its handle was short and often curved to the side to protect the worker's hands from the log being cut. This axe was not used for chopping, but for carving, removing splinters, and turning a round log into a smooth beam. Caring for these tools was a daily ritual. Settlers spent hours sharpening their blades. Special whetstones were used for this purpose. A blunt axe was not only ineffective, it was dangerous, as it could slip off the wood. The sharpness of the blade was a matter of productivity and safety. Mastery of the axe determined the quality of the future house. An experienced woodcutter could fell a tree in a precisely specified place to facilitate its further transportation. And an experienced carpenter could level a log with just a chisel as if it had been passed through a modern machine. These skills were passed down from generation to generation. Axe handles were almost never bought. They were made by hand. Every man knew how to carve a new axe handle from a piece of hickory or ash, perfectly suited to his hand and his style of work. It was a deeply personal tool that often served its owner for a lifetime. The axe was versatile. It was used not only to build houses, but also to chop wood for the hearth, clear land for plowing, build fences, and make simple furniture. The entire material culture of the frontier was built with this simple but perfect tool. It was the key to transforming the wilderness into a livable space. The availability of a high-quality steel axe was one of the main advantages of the settlers. It was a product of the Industrial Revolution that allowed one person to do a huge amount of work. Without it, the development of America's forested areas would have been simply impossible. This unique focus on a single tool is the most unusual detail of the era. It was not the rifle, but the axe that was the main symbol of the pioneer. Like this video if you didn't know about this difference between axes and their significance. Guess how long it would take an experienced 19th century lumberjack to fell a tree with a diameter of half a meter? The answer may surprise you, no more than 30 minutes. But behind this speed were years of practice and a deep understanding of the process. Logging was the first truly dangerous and labor-intensive stage of construction. It all started with choosing trees. 50 to 100 straight trunks were needed for the log cabin. Settlers preferred pine or spruce because of their straight structure and relative ease of processing. Oak was stronger, but working with it was incomparably more difficult. Trees of approximately the same diameter were chosen so that the walls would be even. Before starting to cut, the woodcutter carefully prepared the work area. He cleared the shrubs and small branches around the trunk to ensure he had enough space to maneuver, and more importantly, a way to retreat. This simple safety rule was one of the first things beginners learned. The felling technique itself required precision. On the side where the tree was to fall, a horizontal undercut was made. Then slightly above it, a second diagonal cut was made. The wedge of wood cut in this way determined the direction of the fall. This was the most critical moment, requiring a keen eye. After that, the woodcutter moved to the opposite side of the tree. There he made the main felling cut, which was slightly higher than the top of the first wedge. When the axe penetrated the trunk, the tree began to crackle characteristically. This was a signal to be ready to move away quickly. As soon as the tree began to fall, the worker quickly moved to the side and back, but never ran straight away from the trunk. He watched the falling crown as it could contain dry, broken branches that fell separately and were unpredictable. These branches were called widowmakers and were one of the main causes of accidents. Once the tree was on the ground, the next stage began, cutting off the branches. The trunk was cleared of branches along its entire length, again using a felling axe. It was monotonous but necessary work. The finished whip was then sawn or chopped into logs of the required length, measured logs. The length of the logs depended on the size of the future house. A standard hut rarely exceeded 16 feet, about 5 meters in length, as longer logs were too heavy to lift. All the logs for the walls were prepared at once, in one place, before moving on to the next stage. This process was repeated dozens of times. The settler spent several weeks in the forest, and the result of his labor was a growing mountain of identical logs, neatly stacked on the site of the future house. It was hard, exhausting work that required endurance and perseverance. Which skill do you think was more important for this work? Physical strength or precise calculation? In the next chapter, we will see how these rough, round logs were turned into neat building beams. Once the required number of logs had been felled and delivered to the construction site, the stage began that transformed the wild forest into neat building material. This was the art of hewing. For a simple and quick hut, the logs could be used round, stacking them on top of each other in a bowl. But for a higher quality, warmer, and more durable house, the logs had to be made flat. Most often, the logs were hewn on two opposite sides. This allowed for the creation of smooth interior and exterior walls. Such a hut looked neater, and it was easier to hang shelves or attach furniture to the smooth interior walls. In addition, the flat surfaces fit more tightly together, leaving fewer gaps. The hewing process required a special tool, a wide axe or adze. Before starting work, the log was firmly secured to the ground with wooden wedges. Then the builder climbed onto the log and marked out the future flat surface. A simple but ingenious technique was used for this. A cord rubbed with chalk or charcoal, the cord was stretched along the entire log from one end to the other and then released. Hitting the bark, it left a perfectly straight chalk line. The same line was made on the opposite side. These two lines served as guides for the axe, determining the thickness of the future timber. Then the hardest part began. Taking a regular felling axe, the worker walked along the log, making frequent crosscuts. He chopped the wood from the edge to the chalk line. These cuts, called notches, were made every 20-30 centimeters. They made it easier to remove the bulk of the wood. After the entire log had been notched, the adze came into play. The worker walked along the log, cutting large pieces of wood between the notches. This rough work was called roughing. After that, the log took on a rectangular shape, but the surface remained uneven, with marks from the axe. The final stage was finishing. The worker would again take a wide axe and, standing on the log, would make neat sliding strokes from top to bottom. He would move backwards, removing a thin layer of wood and leveling the surface. In the hands of a master, the adze left a characteristic, slightly wavy pattern, which is so highly valued in old houses today. This process was incredibly laborious. It could take a whole day to plane one long log. The entire area around was covered with mountains of wood chips. These chips, by the way, did not go to waste. They were collected and used for kindling, as bedding, or to fill gaps. For floors and ceiling beams, logs were often split into boards or planks. This was done either by the same method of hewing or with a long two-handed saw. Two workers, one standing on the log and the other below in a specially dug pit, sawed the log lengthwise. The hewn logs were not just more beautiful. They provided a tighter fit, which was critical for heat retention. This heavy, monotonous work was a direct investment in the future comfort and survival of the family during harsh winters.
The tight seams will keep the cold out and the warmth in.
What if I showed you how houses were built that still stand today, without a single nail, screw, metal fastener, or cement? At first glance, it seems impossible, but that's how the first settlers on the frontier built. Their secret was not magic, but engineering. In the corners. The corner was the heart of the log house, the place where the house either stood for centuries or fell apart from the first hurricane. After the logs were hewn and cut to length, the most important stage of the entire construction began. The assembly of the log house, or as the carpenters said, the laying of the crowns. Each crown is a horizontal row of logs laid around the perimeter of the future house. The crowns were laid on top of each other, like rings in a giant wooden pyramid, forming walls that grew taller every day. However, simply laying them on top of each other was not enough. If the logs simply lay on top of each other, the house would collapse at the first gust of wind or under its own weight. To prevent this from happening, each log was firmly joined at the corners where the walls intersected. And this is where the art known as corner lock, or notching, began. This technique was older than the United States itself. It was brought to the West by settlers from Scandinavia, Germany, and Eastern Europe, where the tradition of log cabin construction went back centuries. Each craftsman had his own style, his own shape of lock, but the goal was the same: to achieve a perfect connection that would hold the house together without any nails. The oldest and simplest version was called bowl or oblo. A semicircular notch or bowl was cut into the top of one log, into which the next log was placed perpendicularly. The edges of the bowl were adjusted so that one log tightly embraced the other, preventing water from seeping inside. This method was quick to implement, but it had its drawbacks. The ends of the logs protruded beyond the walls and began to rot over time, and the structure itself did not retain heat well. Settlers in the Wild West, faced with a harsher climate and constant winds, began to use improved types of joints, more precise, tighter, and more durable. The most famous of these was the dovetail notch and its simpler variant, the V-notch. These joints required precision work, but the reward was an almost monolithic structure, where each log became part of a single living organism. The dovetail notch is one of the most beautiful and well-designed joints. A trapezoidal tenon resembling a swallow's spread tail was cut at the ends of each log. An identical groove was made in the perpendicular log. When the logs were joined, the spike entered the groove with little effort, wedging itself under its own weight. The higher the wall rose, the tighter all the crowns came together, turning into a single mass. This lock was self-tightening. The load did not weaken, but on the contrary, strengthened the connection. The work of creating such a lock required exceptional skill. First, the carpenter marked the contours of the future tenon with a charcoal stick or a sharp knife. Then he made cuts with a saw, carefully knocking out the excess wood with an axe and a chisel. Each corner was adjusted individually by hand. Mistakes were not forgiven. If the cut was too deep, the gap would become a bridge for cold air. If it was too shallow, the log would not fit and would warp the entire wall. Experienced craftsmen could determine the correct tightness by the sound. When two logs came together, there was a dull, confident thud, as if the wood itself was sitting in place. The V-shaped notch was a little simpler, but worked on the same principle. A V-shaped ridge was cut into the top of the lower log, and a groove of the same shape was cut into the bottom of the upper log. When laid, they came together like two wedges. This shape not only ensured a tight fit, but also directed water flow outward, preventing moisture from lingering in the corners. In addition, the V-shaped notch was less dependent on wood shrinkage and was better suited for beginners learning the craft on the frontier. The process of laying the crowns was slow, requiring patience and strength. Each log was first lifted onto the wall dry, simply to see where it would lie. The future notches were marked in place, then the log was lowered back to the ground. The joints were cut and it was lifted again. This was done by hand, using simple levers, runners, and inclined poles, so-called skids. Sometimes they worked in pairs or threes, lifting heavy logs to chest level and then rolling them onto the wall. It was hard work, but it brought the family and neighbors together. Building a house on the frontier was almost always a communal endeavor. After laying each crown, the horizontal level was checked, the corners were aligned, and the voids were filled with tree bark or moss. The crowns were joined not only at the corners. Wooden pins, dowels were often inserted between them to prevent displacement. This created a strong, flexible frame that could move slightly during shrinkage without collapsing. It was these corner locks, invisible to the eye, hidden in the body of the house, that were the glue that held the entire structure together. Without a single metal nail, without glue, without cement, only wood, an axe, and human hands. These joints provided not only strength, but also tightness, keeping the heat inside even in 30-degree frost. This technology was passed down from generation to generation, from father to son, by word of mouth, from log cabin to log cabin. It formed a special culture of construction, not mechanical, but almost musical, where each stroke of the axe had its own rhythm. Thanks to it, thousands of houses built in the 19th century are still standing today, having survived blizzards, rains, and heat. Which aspect of this process seems most difficult to you? The precision of the hand, capable of cutting a perfect lock without templates, or the heavy physical labor of lifting a log weighing several hundred pounds to human height? In the next chapter, we will see how the craftsman solved an equally important task: sealing the joints between the logs, without which even a perfect log house would not retain heat. Let's take a closer look at the most perfect, but also the most complex type of corner joint used by settlers: the full dovetail. This technology was brought to America by European immigrants, especially from Germanic and Scandinavian regions, where it had been refined over centuries. The choice of this method indicated that the builder was planning a house for the ages. Unlike simple V-shaped notches, the dovetail joint solves several problems at once. Its complex trapezoidal shape not only firmly connected the logs at the corner, but also actively drained rainwater. The sloping planes of the tenon and groove were designed so that any moisture that fell on the corner did not linger, but immediately ran down. This made the corners of the house, its most vulnerable part, virtually immune to rot. In houses built using this technology, the logs in the corners are best preserved, even after a century and a half. It was an ingenious engineering solution based on a deep understanding of physics and the properties of wood. The process of cutting a dovetail was a real art. It required not only an axe, but also a good handsaw and a set of chisels. Marking was the most critical stage. The builder used a special template or simply marked the corner by eye, relying on his experience. Each log intended for a corner was processed with jeweler's precision. The upper and lower planes of the log were often hewn at a slight angle to create a slope for water drainage, not only in the corners, but also along the entire length of the wall. This required a tremendous amount of manual labor. In addition, the dovetail made the structure incredibly stable. The logs were wedged together in two planes. It was impossible to disassemble such a corner without lifting the entire wall. This gave the log house a monolithic strength that was so important in frontier conditions. In addition to corner locks, there was another trick to give the walls rigidity, especially if the door or window openings were wide. Vertical holes were drilled in the logs on both sides of the future opening. Long wooden rods, called dowels, were hammered into these holes with glue or by force. They tied several crowns together, preventing them from shifting. This method was often used to connect logs lengthwise if one trunk was not enough for the entire wall. Complex locks were cut into the ends of two logs, and they were joined together. This connection was also reinforced with wooden dowels. The use of a dovetail was a sign of wealth and skill. A settler who built such a house for himself invested not only time, but all his skill in it. He was not building a temporary shelter, but a family nest that was to serve his descendants. Today, these methods seem incredibly complex compared to the construction of a frame house. But it was precisely these methods that made it possible to create durable and warm dwellings from the only material available: wood. It was a triumph of craftsmanship over limitations. Erecting the walls was the most spectacular stage of construction. After weeks of tedious preparation on the ground, felling, trimming, and cutting locks, the house finally began to grow upward. This stage often required a collective effort. If a settler was building alone, he could only raise the first few crowns. The help of neighbors was needed to lift heavy logs to human height and above. There was a strong tradition of cabin raising on the frontier. The family that was going to build a house prepared logs, stones for the foundation, and a generous feast. On the appointed day, neighbors from all over the neighborhood gathered, and with their combined efforts, the log house grew to the roof in 1 or 2 days. This custom was not just an act of goodwill, but a form of social survival. Today you help your neighbor, and tomorrow, when you need help building a barn or harvesting, he will help you. This united the community and made it possible to accomplish tasks that were beyond the capabilities of a single family. A simple but effective technique was used to lift the logs. 2 long, sturdy poles were placed along the growing wall, creating an inclined ramp. The logs were rolled up these ramps using ropes or levers. It was hard and dangerous work that required coordination and precision. As the walls grew, the builders immediately laid out the openings for doors and windows. This was one of the most difficult moments. To prevent the logs forming the opening from spreading apart, their ends were temporarily fastened together with a board. A vertical groove was cut into the ends of these logs. When the log house was ready, a sturdy wooden beam, a jamb or window frame, was driven into this groove. This beam rigidly fixed the ends of the logs, preventing them from shifting, and served as a frame for the future door or window. This was another technique that allowed construction without nails while maintaining the strength of the structure. Sometimes, however, another method was used. First, a solid log house was erected without any openings. Only after the walls had been assembled to the required height were windows and doors cut into them. This was done with a 2-handed saw. This method allowed for more accurate marking of the openings, but was more labor-intensive. As the walls were raised, the first layer of insulation was immediately laid between the logs. This could be dried moss, tow, or simply wood shavings. This material filled in the natural irregularities of the wood and reduced gaps, but it was only a preliminary step before the final ceiling. The walls were raised to a height of about 7 to 8 feet, just over 2 meters. This height was sufficient for comfortable movement inside. After that, the roof construction stage began, which had its own unique challenges. Each log laid was a small victory. Watching the walls of your own house grow out of a pile of logs on the ground was a huge moral satisfaction. It was a visible, tangible result of many days of labor. Building the roof was no less difficult and responsible a task than building the walls. For the settler, this was not just a construction stage. It was the moment when the frame of his future home turned into a real dwelling. The roof had to perform several functions at once. It protected from rain and snowstorms, retained heat, and at the same time remained light enough not to destroy the walls under its own weight. In the conditions of the American frontier, where every log was cut by hand and tools were minimal, this became a real test of engineering ingenuity. Roofing materials were chosen based on what was available. Most often it was wood, the only universal material that served for walls, floors, and roofs. The roof structure had to be as simple as possible so that it could be erected without unnecessary calculations and with the help of one or two people. The most common option was a gable roof, reliable, stable, and easy to build even without complex tools. Its shape allowed snow to slide down easily without creating excessive load, and rainwater to quickly flow down the slopes without lingering on the surface. The first thing to do was to form the gables, the triangular end walls that determine the shape of the entire roof. They were made from the same logs as the walls of the house. Only each subsequent log was slightly shorter than the previous one. Gradually, layer by layer, a triangular pyramid resembling a stepped wedge grew. The ends of the logs were hewn with an axe at the right angle to accurately replicate the slope of the future roof. The work required precision. An error of a few degrees could lead to the entire structure becoming skewed. When both gables were ready, the most crucial moment arrived. The installation of the ridge beam, or as it was called in the Russian north, the prince. It was the longest and heaviest log in the entire house, the main supporting beam of the roof. All subsequent elements rested on it. Lifting the prince to the top of the log house was a feat. It was necessary to use levers, ropes, and ladders, often manually, without winches. This moment was considered the symbolic completion of the box of the house. It was then that the builders first saw the house take its final shape. After installing the ridge beam between the gables, several longitudinal beams, or slats, were laid parallel to it. These were thinner logs or poles that rested on the sloping logs of the gables and served as a support for the roofing. This system was surprisingly simple and extremely reliable. It did not require complex trusses and could be erected even by one person with sufficient perseverance. The frame was light but stable, ideally suited to the harsh winds of the frontier. When the roof base was ready, the most important stage began: roofing. Everything depended on it: the warmth, dryness, and durability of the house. In wooded areas, the most accessible and high-quality material was shingles, or wood chips, long, thin strips of wood that settlers chipped off logs by hand. Special tools were used for this purpose: knives with long blades and wooden mallets. They worked slowly and carefully, making sure that the wood fibers were not damaged. Only then would the shingles not absorb moisture and allow water to flow freely downwards. The choice of wood species played a key role. Cedar, pine, and oak were best suited. They combined strength, flexibility, and resistance to decay. Cedar, especially red cedar, was considered ideal: light, fragrant, and almost immune to mold. Split shingles, unlike sawn boards, retained the natural grain of the wood and were therefore much stronger. Water did not penetrate deep into the wood, but slid off the surface as if it were smooth bark. The process of laying the shingles was painstaking and required attention to detail. They started at the bottom, from the eaves, and moved up to the ridge. Each new row was laid overlapping the previous one to cover the joints. This created a dense, multi-layered covering resembling fish scales. It was almost airtight. Even during a downpour, water could not penetrate inside. In addition, such a roof breathed, allowing air to circulate freely, which prevented condensation and rot. The shingles were fastened in different ways. If a settler had iron nails, he would nail each plate by hand. a long but reliable job. However, iron was rare, especially in the far frontier, where blacksmiths were few and far between. Therefore, wooden pins, wedges, or flexible willow rods were most often used. Sometimes the shingles were pressed down from above with long poles that were attached to the purlins, creating a pressing effect, as in old roofs without nails. This required more effort but made the roof resistant to wind. Such a roof was surprisingly durable. It could last 20 to 30 years with almost no repairs. Its lightness prevented wall deformation, and its structure allowed it to withstand heavy snowfalls. At the same time, it was relatively safe in terms of fire. Unlike straw, shingles burned slowly and smoldered rather than flared up. In areas where wood was scarce, straw, reeds, or grass were sometimes used. But the settlers knew very well that such a roof was a temporary measure, lasting a year or two at most. The completion of the roof was a turning point in the fate of the house. It was the moment when the building acquired a soul. From that day on, the house became truly protected from rain, wind, sun, and cold. Now it was possible to work inside without fear of bad weather. It was after the roof was installed that the family usually moved in. Even if there was no floor, windows, or doors, they were under their own roof. For the settler, this meant one thing: he had conquered nature. Many placed a symbolic bunch of grass or a branch above the ridge, a sign of completion and gratitude to the earth. The roof was more than just an architectural detail. It symbolized shelter, hope, and human perseverance. When the last shingle was laid, the house came to life, ready to withstand whatever the harsh frontier had in store. Even the most skillfully built house of hewn logs with perfect dovetails was not monolithic. There were inevitable gaps and cracks between the logs. In dry weather, they were barely noticeable, but in winter, icy winds penetrated through them, and during rain, moisture. The final step in transforming a log cabin into a warm dwelling was sealing, known as chinking, or caulking. This process consisted of two stages. The first stage, chinking, involved filling the large gaps between the logs. Any available elastic material was used for this purpose. Dried moss collected in the forest was considered ideal. It was elastic, retained heat well, and did not rot. The settler took a wooden spatula or a special tool and tightly packed the moss into the gaps. If the gaps were too large, thin wooden slats or splinters were first inserted into them, and only then were they caulked with moss. The goal was to create a resilient filling gasket around the entire perimeter of the house, both inside and outside. But moss alone could not protect against rain and wind. It had to be covered with something more durable and water-resistant. This is where the second stage began, daubing or plastering. The settler had to prepare a special mortar from readily available materials. The basis of this mortar was almost always clay. It was dug up on the banks of a stream or in a quarry. Clay was an excellent binder, but in its pure form it cracked when it dried. To make the mortar strong and elastic, reinforcing and binding components were added to the clay. Sand was most often used as a filler. The correct proportion of clay and sand produced a strong, non-cracking mortar. For additional strength and elasticity, grass, straw, or even simply crushed dry leaves were added to the mixture. Sometimes lime was added to the mortar if it could be obtained, which made it almost as strong as modern cement. This mortar, essentially a primitive adobe, was carefully mixed, adding water until a thick plastic mass was obtained. Then this mass was carefully applied, either by hand or with a trowel, to cover the gaps above the moss. The clay adhered tightly to the wood and moss, creating a sealed, airtight seam. This process was long and messy, but absolutely necessary. After drying, the clay coating became hard as stone. It sealed the house securely. The walls of the hut took on a distinctive appearance. Dark logs separated by light strips of mortar. This double barrier of moss and clay was incredibly effective. The moss provided insulation and elasticity, while the clay protected against wind and water. Such a house became warm and cozy. Inside the house, the final touch was often the construction of a hearth or fireplace. It was laid out of wild stone, fastened with the same clay mixture. The fireplace served both for heating and cooking. The chimney was also led through the roof, carefully insulating it from wooden structures with clay and stones. We have come all the way from the wild forest to the finished house. We have seen how simple materials, wood, stone, moss, and clay, were used to create a reliable dwelling. Every stage of this process, from felling a tree to sealing the last crack, was filled with hard work, skill, and a deep understanding of nature. The log cabin was not just a building. It was a symbol of independence, the result of the titanic efforts of one family, and the main point of support in the exploration of a new world. These houses, built without a single nail, were so sturdy that many of them still stand today, serving as a silent monument to the perseverance and ingenuity of the pioneers. This process shows how simple technologies, honed over centuries, allowed humans to survive and thrive in the harshest conditions. It was true survival architecture, where every axe stroke and every lump of clay was of vital importance. What other topics from the history of the American frontier would you like to see on our channel? Perhaps you are interested in the life of trappers in the Rocky Mountains or the construction of the first railroads? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next research projects.